Hello there, and welcome to Book 2 of St. Augustine's Confessions. The last time we met, I had asked you to write down the last phrase from Book 1. So let's look at it together for the sake of continuity. Thus you will keep me, and the things that you gave me will be both increased and perfected. And I will be with you, for you have also given it to me that I exist. Isn't it interesting that that book ends with the word exist? Just reviewing what we looked at in Book 1, that Augustine sees his life as a gift, and he knows his very existence comes from God alone. And that's going to lead us right into Book 2. So going into Book 2, I want to give you just some themes to think about. We see in Book 2, you probably have already noticed this, beauty versus counterfeit beauty. For Augustine, God is beautiful, but he could get himself into a pickle by being drawn to the lower beauties of the earth. If you've been in our intellectual society for a while, you can see we had the same theme with Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. That's the theme of the novel, is beauty. How do I get to beauty without being drawn into just earthly beauty? So you could see the brothers K picking up on this theme from Augustine. And then in this Book 2, something we can all relate to. You know, Augustine is showing us, I don't understand my own sin. Why did I sin? Why did I do that? What's going on? That's why I was saying it's very modern. We don't always understand ourselves, our own sin. There is the theme of silence. I thought I'd have some silence there for a moment. There's the theme of deafness. It's no small thing in the Bible that Jesus heals the deaf, the dumb, the blind, the mute. Those are related to the deeper spiritual sufferings of deafness and God's presence. We mentioned presence in Book 1. Also, a difficult subject, bad parents. Augustine's parents made a lot of mistakes, which I think is so wonderful because it gives hope to everybody. Of course, stolen fruit, which we'll get to, and chasing nothing. We chase after nothing, right? In St. Paul, I think it's in St. Paul that says, or maybe it's one of the Gospels, why are you laboring for what does not satisfy? That's actually Isaiah. It's in Isaiah. Why are you laboring for what does not satisfy? Why do we chase after nothingness? It's a theme. I think the biggest theme, though, these are smaller themes, would be disintegration. If you look carefully at the writing here, chapter 1. I wish to bring back to my mind my past foulness and the carnal corruptions of my soul. This is not because I love them, but that I may love you, my God. Out of love for your love, I do this. In the bitterness of my remembrance, I tread again my most evil ways, so that you may grow sweet to me, O sweetness that never fails, O sweetness happy and enduring, which gathers me together again from that disordered state in which I lay in shattered pieces, wherein turned away from you the one, I spent myself upon the many. So there's that theme I was just mentioning that we see throughout the whole novel, the whole autobiography, is Augustine is chasing after things that will never satisfy him. In that process, he's being deaf to God and being himself fragmented and broken. So finding himself again, this is a theme that we will keep seeing. In this passage here, we see Augustine as an important witness to the ancient idea of language. Scholar Philip Burton says this book, The Confessions, is the single most important exponent of Christian language theory in the West. And Augustine's engagement with what it means to speak, I said that in the previous book, is a structural feature of the work, because we're seeing what it's like when Augustine first begins to speak. And have you noticed the motif of Job in here? It might be different because our version doesn't have footnotes, but if you look at the way he talks about his passions, I'm on page 24, number 4. He says, "But I, poor wretch, foamed over. I followed after the sweeping tide of passions, and I departed from you." There's this language of water and boundaries and sweeping, and it comes from the book of Job, actually. If you jump up a little bit higher, same page in the middle of number 3, he says, "I might have listened more heedfully to your voice as it sounded from the clouds." So this idea of God's voice, the waters. So there is a motif of, in particular, the 38th chapter of Job. I'll just read to you a small part so you can see it as a framework. This is verse 8. "Who shut within doors the sea when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling bands? When I set limits for it and fastened the bar of its door and said, 'Thus far shall you come, but no further, and here shall your proud waves be stilled.'" Job and the ocean, there's a lot of that here in this book. Also, another very important scripture for Augustine is Genesis chapter 1, verse 9. This is the verse about God creating water. And this is Augustine describing his youth. He calls it adolescentia. Okay, adolescence. This is the gathering of the waters, the passions. The imagery in this book shows the waters out of control. And this is the book where we read where Augustine falls. He falls. And this failure of Augustine in this book is really that he fails to acquire the divine order in the third day. So let's go back to Genesis. If you're reading Confessions, it's very helpful. He's always has Genesis in mind. And Augustine wrote a whole commentary on Genesis. This was his thing. But if you look here, God said, "Let there be a dome in the middle of the waters to separate one body from another." God made the dome. It separated the waters. Evening came, morning followed, second day. "Then let the water under the sky be gathered into a single basin so the dry land may appear." So it's like Augustine he's in the waters, but where is the dry land? He has not found it in this book. He's in the middle of all of the waters. He's equating that with adolescentia. Okay. So very, very vivid metaphors of this. A lot of flux going on. Where he's trying to see, later in hindsight, what is God trying to teach him? Which, if you look at the bottom of that page 24 of that same page, he says, "You are always present to aid me, merciful in your anger, and charging with the greatest bitterness and disgust all my unlawful pleasures, so that I might seek after pleasure that was free from disgust. To that end, when I could find it, it would be in none but you, Lord, in none but you. For you fashioned sorrow into a lesson for us." That's a theme of this book also, where you see the young Augustine not listening, but there is sorrow. And as he's looking back, he sees that was God's way of correcting him, and he's asking the Lord about that. So we see that. There's also, I think, the question about his parents. I'm on page 25. "My parents took no care to save me by marriage from plunging into ruin." I thought I would share with you what a scholar says about this. There's been a lot of discussion about Augustine and his parents. What is going on? Augustine saying? Is he saying that it would have been better if he had remained celibate and his parents had taught him self-control? Should his parents have sent him into marriage so that he would not have burned with lust? Both are honorable possibilities. We kind of get the feeling God could have led Augustine to either. I think in the way Augustine presents it, it's not about the choice. It's more about hearing and deafness. I think he wishes his parents would have been listening. If they were listening, then maybe they would have known what to have done with him. So either his parents could have arranged a marriage, or even he himself could have heeded God's call. I think it's kind of left open. But he's recognizing that no one's really listening. Speaking of listening, throughout this book, through the scripture, it's like there's all these scriptural voices advocating for chastity, but Augustine can't hear them. And just kind of that spoiler alert that I will give you, Augustine, for much of his young life, cannot hear. He looks back and knows the Lord's been calling him. He can't hear it. When will he hear it? Do you know? It's the famous scene. It's when he's in the garden. He finally hears it. And who does he hear it from? It's from little children saying, Tolde lege, pick up the book. So I kind of just want to get the reader, excited to see, gee, my friend Augustine, he can't listen, but he's going to. He's going to have to go through a lot, but he's going to get to a point where he can listen. This listening and this fall, as you can probably tell from this book, is because of sexual sin. So we're going to look a little bit more closely to that. Now, just want to defend a little bit his parents. If you look on page 26, he does say explicitly that God, you had begun to build your temple within my mother's breast. He knows his mother already has the Holy Spirit inside of her. However, she is still worldly. She wants what's best for her son career-wise. She doesn't always make the best choices for him. We also find out later Monica liked to drink. So we don't know if her drinking got in the way of this at that time. She enjoyed her wine a bit too much. So she wasn't perfect, but we do know she had a relationship with the Lord. And he'll say on page 26, did you in truth remain silent to me? Very much the question of silence, deafness, presence, listening. And he'll go on to say, his mother, she started in sanctity, but she didn't complete what she should have done for her child. Now, I think as we go deeper here into the stolen fruit, I think it's the difficult question about Augustine's sexual sin. And I think we're in the year 2024. This book's been around a long time. And I think in every generation, all the scholars struggle with how to interpret Augustine. Some keep Augustine's sexual sin at arm's length and don't really want to go there. I think some exaggerate his sexual sin. Some of them even call him an addict, addicted to sex. I've read scholars who say Augustine had a mistress. He was faithful to her. It wasn't like he was a playboy. He was faithful to one woman. So it's not like he had a harem. So I think there can be some exaggeration about Augustinian sin. And some scholars think Augustine was too hard on himself. So there's different ways to look at it. And then there is the scene here in this book of Augustine's father. Augustine's father is noting his son's sexual maturity, and he's pleased. I think Augustine wishes his father would have said, let's get this child married. He's pleased in a worldly way that Augustine is frankly disgusted by. So it's not a presentation of virtue. It's a presentation of vice. Some people are shocked by it, but I think if you study history, this is nothing shocking at all. This is history. This is the life of families, and Augustine's looking back at that. For our purposes, what I think is more important actually is Augustine is using the imagery of the fruit, the pear, to give us an example of what we would call the interpretation of his life authoritatively. This is an issue of authority because he is taking the past, he's taking an event that's happening, and he's now rewriting it later under the umbrella of God's protection and giving it a fresh look and then presenting it to us, the reader. So this is the issue of authority, let's say, narration. I don't want to say power. I don't want to use a Marxist word, but I would say who's interpreting the narrative. And Augustine is saying, I've had enough time to reflect that now I can see what has happened. And I think that's the more interesting part of the story. If you look at page 29, I had mentioned to you the issue of counterfeit beauty. Again, he's talking about his struggle with beauty and his search after lower beauties. And that's very important. I also think the theme of patterns is apparent here. Augustine is showing us two patterns, kind of like a juxtaposition. On the one hand, he's living as if God doesn't exist. On the other, he knows God's present, maybe subconsciously. And he flat out says, I read it to you earlier, that God chastised him, and that was a form of God's teaching. That was a way of God not being silent. So there is this juxtaposition. So on the one hand, the punishment gives testimony to the divine pattern. On the other hand, he's violating that pattern. And so now Augustine is rereading his life, and it's kind of like some scholars say that he's saying, oh, that was the Old Testament, this is the New Testament. You know, he's looking at patterns. But don't miss this. The very people who should have been looking out for Augustine the most did not see the divine pattern. This, I think, is one of the most important points of this chapter, of this book, is that this is an implicit criticism of both of his parents. Now, very important change for the reader. I'm going to go back to page 25, chapter 3. Don't want you to miss this. In the middle of that number 5, he says, "To whom do I tell these things? Not to you, my God, but before you. I tell them to my own kind, to mankind, or to whatever small part of it may come upon these books of mine." So at that point, this is a big change. It's like he's stopping this maybe monologue or dialogue with God, and he's opening it up to the audience. And some say, gosh, he's just not opening it up enough. We kind of feel like we're intruding. But he is definitely opening it up to us. He's reading it. He is writing it for us for a purpose. And he directly addresses it there. And I think that is important. This is really where his authorial voice breaks off into confession. And also, if you pay close attention, it's really interesting. It's like it's like he's speaking in a void almost. It's this narration to God alone. Now we have the human audience, and it's almost like Augustine is admitting, I'm frustrated because God is there, but he's silent. It's the paradox of a silent God, but we need to hear from him and we need to talk to him. The accessibility of God is an issue in the Confessions, and I want to make clear it's not conditioned on the right pattern of words for Augustine, but on the right pattern of life. When I say pattern, it may not be apparent in our reading in the Latin. Apparently, it's very clear that Augustine is using the image of patterns. And that once we find the divine pattern and we follow the pattern, we will hear the Lord. And our elders should be giving us the proper pattern, but they have to see it first. And they weren't. Okay. Also, I think as he's talking about his parents, we kind of see himself through their eyes. And clearly, Monica's view is the most trustworthy. She's the only one of all three of them to have faith. Now, let's look. We have in chapter 6 the anatomy of evil, grace that keeps and heals. And then we're going to go on to the pears. But real quick, on the top of page 30, I think it's fascinating that he mentions Catiline. Now, Catiline is a very important figure in ancient Rome. Our kids study a lot of this at Holy Child. Catiline's very famous. Around 65 BC, he had a failed conspiracy to seize the Senate. Cicero famously denounced him. For Augustine, Catiline is the perfect example of pagan evil. But even Catiline, Augustine says, he was looking for something. He committed evil for a purpose. And this is making Augustine question himself, like, why did I commit evil? I didn't need those pears. So what was I doing? So throughout Augustine's writings, he will always, of course, it makes sense, point to ancient Rome. So it's good to know, it's good to bring up our Roman history to kind of see of where he's going with that. So remember, as I mentioned, the past is lived, but now the past is being interpreted. The interpretation of the past now becomes the life of the present. We have an alternation between narrative and meditation. We can feel the tension. It's not resolved. There's a lot of tension there. Divine order always returns, though, just like those waves in the book of Job and the book of Genesis. So I wanted you to see how this book is like an ocean. There's a veiled dialogue with an imaginary audience, but a formal address to God. So a lot going on. Now, people ask, why does Augustine give so much time to the theft of the pears? This is really hilarious when you study it with high schoolers. They cannot get over it. Like, why is there so much attention to the pears? When you read it in a group, it can almost kind of seem unreal to our modern ears. But it's there for a reason. This is how Augustine chose to show us the moment of his fall. And of course, it's definitely connected to a sexual fall. He's definitely relating it to that. And so if you go through his torment and what he's doing, he's wondering, why did I even steal those pears? I didn't need them. And it's the famous Augustinian conception of sin. What is sin? It's nothing. It's nothing. It's the absence of evil. So nothing is nothing save evil, and there is no thingness to evil. So he and his friends are chasing after nothing. So what ultimately was the attraction? The camaraderie of thieves. And notice they are amateur thieves at that. He insists he wouldn't have done it had it not been for bad company. We often talk about the importance of good books and bad books. It's the same thing for company. Bad company will lead us to make bad choices. Good company will always edify us, and he learned that. And then part of him too, though, I think his constant questioning, like, why did I do this? Why did I do this? Is ultimately for Augustine. You can never give a rational reason for committing evil. It's definitely Augustinian. There's no rational reason. It's temporary insanity. And it's only education that helps us to see properly. This is a beautiful book, The Confessions, about proper education. That's why we're doing it through a school, because when we educate our children with intention, when we bring them the true, the good, the beautiful, we're giving them eyes to see Otherwise, they're not going to have the right eyes to see. At the end of the book, Augustine is repulsed by his own sin. He cannot look at it anymore. He wants to turn away from it. I will just draw your attention, though, to that question on 33. He says, who understands his sins? I love that, because who does? We all have to grapple with, why was I doing that? What's the root of that? Anyone I know who wants to be a saint is doing that, is looking for the root of their main sins. And then on page 34, he says, behold, the living record of my soul lies before you, my God. By myself, I wouldn't have committed that theft, in which what pleased me was not what I stole, but the fact that I stole. And so as we, end this book, let's look at it, because I think there's very important themes here. Chapter 10, a soul in waste. Number 18, who can untie this most twisted and intricate mass of knots? It is a filthy thing. I do not wish to think about it. I do not wish to look upon it. So you get the sense that Augustine sharing it with us is painful for him. He's doing it for our good. It's not easy for him. I desire you, O justice and innocence, beautiful and comely to all virtuous eyes, and I desire this unto a satiety that can never be satiated. With you there is true rest and life untroubled. Rest. He asks in book 1, or he tells us in book 1, our hearts are restless. There's just no rest with all. We're looking for things that never satisfy us. He's reminding us here. With the pears, God's our only rest. He who enters into you enters into the joy of his Lord. Again, coming from Scripture. And he shall have no fear, and he shall possess his soul most happily in him who is the supreme good. I fell away from you, my God, and I went astray, too far astray from you, the support of my youth, and I became to myself a land of want. Now, what is that? What's the land of want? We should be thinking of Luke 15:14, the prodigal son. What Augustine is saying is, not only was I the prodigal son, but I became the famine. In book 2, there's a lot of imagery, agricultural imagery, farming imagery, and imagery of the prodigal son. In this book, all these metaphors is to build a picture where there's absent agricultural authority. It's really brilliant how he does this. It's like, who's tending the field? What have I become? I've become a land of famine, and no one was watching out for me. That's basically what he's saying. He also has images of a desert. In a sense, his own father was a desert. Who's the farmer? God. The parable of the sower is there. There's a lot of wordplay in Latin. But I always want to remind us of the hope in this book, because his father is not a good father. We're going to see other fathers in the book, other father figures, and Ambrose is going to be the father. And even if some of us are still looking for father figures, I take comfort as a Catholic that Ambrose is my father also. Augustine's my father. So is Gregory. So is Jerome. We have lots of fathers who lead us to the Father. And because of the Father's steadfast love, if we need a father, he always shows us a way as long as we're listening and looking. And that's the message of this book. Keep looking, keep listening, and God is going to show us where we've been deaf, where we've become our own famine, and where the rescue is. And of course, Jesus rescues all of us. So even though the book ends kind of a dark note, we know that there's good news down the line. So that's good. So to answer everyone's question, why do we spend so much time on the pears? It's really the Augustinian examination of sin in and of itself. And although he's a doctor of the church, and although he is giving us a sound definition, there is still mystery. He is still saying we don't always understand why we sin. But it's good to ask. It's good to examine. So thank you for taking the time to examine that with me. And I will see you next time in Book 3.